Welcome everyone into 602. We're going to go get started. My name is Michael Dickens. I am the curator and director of the New Gallery here at Austin Peay State University. I'm also chair of the Visiting Artist Speaker Committee. Tonight's event is brought to you by CECA, which is the Center of Excellence for the Creative Arts, and Austin Peay State University's Department of Art and Design. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Yuchi, Shawnee, and Cherokee First Nations on which we're organizing, learning, and broadcasting today. I know we have many visitors tonight that are joining us from outside of Austin Peay, so thank you all for joining us. It's an honor to be able to share our renowned programming with the rest of the world. You can please follow us on the social medias. So you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and just, stay informed of what we have going on here. Let's see here. So tonight's format will consist of a talk with some time for Q&A afterwards. The chat will be turned off. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I'll do my best to moderate the conversation at the end, but I have a feeling we will not get to all the questions this evening. So I'll go ahead and apologize in advance. And if you have a question that pops up during the talk, feel free to go ahead and add it anytime, and we'll get to it first. Let's see here. So with all this out of the way, it's my honor to introduce our guest this evening, Stephanie Syjuco. Stephanie works in photography, sculpture, and installation, moving from handmade and craft-inspired mediums to digital editing, and archive excavations. Recently, she has focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of racialized, exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. Born in the Philippines, Syjuco received her MFA from Stanford University and BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute. She's a recipient of the 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship Award, a 2009 Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptor Award, and recently a 2020 Tiffany Foundation Award. Her work has been exhibited widely, including at MoMA and PS1, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the ZKM Center for Art and Technology, California Biennial at the Orange County Museum of Art, the 12th Havana Biennial, the 2015 Asian Art Biennial in Taiwan, among many others. So as a longtime educator, she is an associate professor of sculpture at the University of California, Berkeley, and she lives in Oakland, California, which is where she is coming from us tonight. So please welcome tonight's CECA's visiting artist, Stephanie Syjuco.
Great. Hi, everybody. I wish I could see your faces, but I'm going to imagine that you're there. It's nice to join you. And actually, Michael, thank you for the introduction, because we've been planning this now for, I think, about a year and a half.
At least, yeah.
Was different, and then we kept kind of pushing it forward. So finally, we're here together. But my regret really is that I can't be there in person. So it would have been nice to meet the whole community. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And just to give a little bit of overview, I'm focusing on works from about the last 4 years. And so I'm not going to share every single thing that I've done during then, but I have kind of sectioned it off into projects that have to do with what I consider issues of imaging and representation. And so the title of my talk tonight is called The Visible Invisible: on the Politics of Imaging and Representation. And so, as Michael mentioned, I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically Oakland, and I'm a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. So, all right. So overall, my work has a tendency to be quite large scale. This is just a kind of sampling of what some of the projects have looked like in the past. I'm actually not going to talk about any of these previous ones, but I just wanted to share images of them because they do kind of explore a wide variety of topics. Plus, they are usually in collaboration with museums and institutions, and sometimes involve the production of hundreds or even thousands of objects. And in some cases, they also have a kind of interactive or participatory experience. And then I also consider my work pretty wide-ranging. So as Michael mentioned in the introduction, I've been focusing recently on photography, but I'm actually a professor in sculpture, but I see that as this kind of branching out into lots of different related mediums. And you can kind of see this constellation of things swirling around from everything from, say, installation, video, photography, new media, digital 3D objects, social practice, which also includes, areas such as like workshops, print and publication formats. And then I've also been kind of known for going into the area of textiles and craft and extreme fabrication. So, the great thing about being a contemporary artist today is that it really is like super plugged into lots of different materials and methods and medias. I also see my work as existing in multiple spheres. So even though I'm an artist, I also consider myself an educator. And, if you kind of had to make this very loose Venn diagram of the areas that I think my work actually travels in, the art world is just one of them, and those are the things that we consider like the studios or galleries or museums. As a professor, I'm also, doing a lot of work and projects within schools and institutions. And then I also have works that exist in the sphere of the public. So, those are community-based projects or things that I think go out into society or engage in public life. So, not everything is just compressed into the quote unquote art world. I'm also sharing this image because I think it's an interesting kind of backdrop to some of the projects I'll be talking about. And, this is a kind of found photo of a studio photography setup. And I think what's interesting about this is that it shows all the apparatus from like the lighting technology to backdrops and the whole kind of stage production around the creation of images. We have a tendency to think about photography as being a document of, say, reality, but in many cases, photos and images are really the results of highly composed or even fabricated scenes or ideas. And I am going to start off, though, with one project, which is not photo-based, but it kind of dovetails in from some of the larger institutional and social practice projects that I've done. In 2018, I was commissioned by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art to do a 3-day public project. And I decided to focus on what appeared to be, or create what appeared to be a used bookstore. The installation actually, sold books to the general public. I also invited 3 other organizations to work with me, one being Related Tactics, the Prelinger Library, and the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library, which is the kind of fundraising support arm of the San Francisco Public Library. And with this bookstore, this was in the lobby of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and people could go in to kind of browse and buy things. But as soon as you started to go into it, you realized that the categories were completely rearranged. And so I was thinking about this project really as a kind of critique of the ways in which we organize and catalog information in order to privilege or highlight specific ways of looking at the world that are actually quite skewed or assumed to be true, but are, just a kind of a specific viewpoint. And so, if you look at some of the areas in this bookstore, it's everything from, there's a whole category on, say, revolutions. There's also an area called wealth and accumulation, collapse. And, browsing through it, it really was this way of, it was a collaboration with the other artist organizations that I invited. And we decided to recreate sort of new categories to reorganize things. So, in some areas, there was also really, I think, kind of niche categories. So, how we learn to see ourselves through the lens of whiteness. There was a little section called When Your Culture Becomes a Trend. And then another section called White Women Discovering Themselves Amongst the Other. And again, these are just normal books that you would find in a used bookstore. Many of them were actually donated to the San Francisco Public Library to be resold in their bookshop, and they were considered low value books. And so part of my intention was also to take these kind of very common low value books and add to their value by creating new categories for them. And so I think it was interesting too, because it was a critique. And so when the public came in, they were kind of confronted with a whole new way of looking, through a different lens at these books. So what kind of books could be found in a whole area called uprisings? And how does that also collapse together different areas that could be found in a traditional bookstore quite far apart from each other, but in this alternative reorganization, they could be adjacent and also in support of each other. I also had fun playing with some of these collapsed categories. So thinking about, this collapsed section called craft and witchcraft. And so within this, you could even find, basic books on, paper making, along with casting, magical spells and demonology. So, this thinking about both of them as forms of craft really created a kind of unexpected commingling of ideas. And then I also decided to have in here a section called men's studies. And this is in direct opposition to what we usually see as women's studies in, say, a bookstore. And I thought that kind of flipping that around became a way to also question notions of both gender, hierarchy, and also patriarchy, because, where is that a kind of study within, a typical organization of information? I also thought too that, when we segregate areas such as women's studies into their own category, what happens is that you're placing it apart from, the entire spectrum of knowledge, and you're to the audience, it could appear limiting. If women's studies was incorporated into everything else, what would it look like? And also, conversely, what is a study on masculinity or even patriarchy? And it was humorous, like a lot of things could fit into this area. And a lot of the books were also quite outdated, which is really interesting too, because, then you get this very sort of kind of time capsule look at whole areas. This is the section that I think was called Radical Desires. So it was everything from, fiction like The Scarlet Letter to this book, Women Without Children, to gay urban porn, all collapsed together in one area. And then I also paired books together so that audience members were forced to buy sets of books. You couldn't buy one without the other. This was like a special paired section. And this is an image of, one side and the other side, where I was pairing a copy of Edward Said's critical theory book, Culture and Imperialism, and on the other side with a book on Victorian gardens, because, trying to think about those two ideas as big bookends to each other and also intrinsically linked. And, other examples of old and outdated books that were also paired together. This is before they were shrink wrapped into a set. And, it was humorous as well. So pairing Bill Gates's The Road Ahead with Jared Diamond's Collapse is both a kind of critical look at, the extreme boosterism and optimistic idea of progress, with the notion too that some societies that have this type of hubris have a tendency to fail at some point. And we also had this is a kind of overview of all of our categories. So I'm starting off with this project. Well, one, because, it was commissioned by a museum. And so we had a really wonderful kind of, space for it to be in. We had a built-in audience, but also because we wound up really being able to play with these categories of, of knowledge and reorganize it and put a new lens on it. And the wonderful thing about this project also was that it raised over $20,000 in used book sales in just 3 days. And all that money went to benefit the education program of the San Francisco Public Library. So again, by thinking of like, how can I create this added value, to these very low end books? It was the knowledge, the new sort of frame around it that was effective in doing so. And so back to this notion, though, of image editing and manipulation, and in a way, I guess, reframing or framing. Two kind of key visuals that I've been playing with the last couple of years has been both the chroma key green backdrop, which is the image you see on the left, the green screen that is usually used as in the background. And when you're photographing or videotaping something, you're supposed to be able to then swap out that green color with an entirely different scene. So you're kind of, like superimposing something on top of, behind it later. And then on the right-hand side is this gray and white checkerboard pattern that some of you who are familiar with digital Photoshop editing might have seen before. And it's the very last layer in a Photoshop background that's supposed to be a kind of transparent layer that you're not supposed to see. It's the indication that, it's at the very end. And I'm using these two very vibrant and actually very visible symbols, specifically because they're hard to not see. It's ironic that they're both supposed to not be there, but at the same time, they're highly visible. And so how I first applied it, though, was in 2017. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and directly after the 2016 presidential election, there was a rise on college campuses, especially on the West Coast, of right-wing speakers that were coming to take advantage of this so-called free speech possibilities on campuses. And with that were speakers who were coming with very white supremacist views. And so there was this conflict on campus about, both notions of acceptability in terms of free speech, but also the idea that people were taking advantage of that. And so there was a lot of conflict and a lot of protests on campus. I was witness to these protests and also saw how the media manipulations of the messaging was actually really changing the public perception. If you remember some of the language used around the time, and this was also during the Charlottesville events, there was this notion that both sides of the political equation should be given equal platform. And I think that didn't sit with me very properly at all. And I decided to make an exhibition that kind of looked at protest imagery as well as photographs of protesters, and to also try to hint at how those images have been manipulated or even obscured by the media. So I did an exhibition shortly after some of these early protests, and in 2017 made an exhibition called Citizens, which was at Ryan Lee Gallery in New York. And you can kind of see, there's photographs in it. There's also these, what appear to be these protest banners that are held aloft by steel structures, as well as this gray and white checkerboard background. On closer inspection, though, these fabric panels they're hand sewn by myself, and they're actually taken from a protest banner that had been rephotographed many times at UC Berkeley and was put on the news media quite a bit. I was downloading photographs of the same banner. And you can't read, it's very difficult to read the text because the way that the people were holding it, the way that the banner was dipping and kind of folding in on itself actually wound up obscuring the text. I downloaded those photographs and blew them up to what would have been life size, cut it out, and also sewed it up to be a kind of physical representation of the images that we were seeing. And so I left threads loose along the whole thing as well, so that you could kind of see that it was completely hand fabricated. And so it's difficult to read, and that's on purpose. This really was about how the message of protest and resistance to, right-wing policy was being heavily obscured and also kind of skewed into, a kind of really difficult to understand direction. These were also held up by steel structures instead of actual people. And on the wall were photographs that appeared to depict protesters. But these were actually photographs that I produced with students at UC Berkeley, in which we were recreating. I was having them model for me. We were recreating some of the protesters that had shown up to physically protest against the right-wing white supremacist speakers. And if the reason people mask up when they go to protests, and remember, this was back in 2017, so this was before masks were, pretty much something that we're all used to seeing now on people. The reason people mask up is to avoid being doxxed, or to avoid being kind of pointed out. And so it's for their own protection. So in order to actually, so how do you create a photograph of someone who is unphotographable, in the sense that you don't want to reveal their identity? Myself and my students, we came up with kind of composites of what we remembered seeing. And so together I had them sit, for me as in a kind of portrait studio. And it was a way to also mark what we saw, as well as somehow involve the students in some way in the recreation of it. And so this is, I titled all of them Citizens. This is Citizen Portrait of R, Citizen Portrait of S. And all the students that I worked with to sit for me were actually students that found themselves in the line of fire of the governmental administration. So these were Black, brown, queer, and trans students and undocumented folks who were, the targets of the administration. And by working with them together, I really wanted to both, honor their individuality, as well as, protect the identities of the original protesters, that we had witnessed. So it was a kind of combination of both things. This is Citizen Portrait of B. And behind the entire exhibition was a completely handmade, hand-sewn backdrop. So this is a fabric backdrop consisting of 2-inch gray and white fabric squares that were sewn together in my studio to look like the Photoshop, digital transparency filter. And the final thing is, 13 feet by 26 feet wide. And I wanted to hand make it to kind of talk also about how, just because something is a digital image or because it's a video on screen, it doesn't mean that it wasn't highly fabricated or that, it was edited somehow. And if you look behind the whole screen, you can also see, I left the seams raw so that you could see that it was completely constructed. I mean, it's essentially like a giant quilt almost. And, around this time too, in 2017, this was the beginning of a lot of revisiting of historical precedents where, the incarceration, in 1942, the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, because of the so-called, the fear of them after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That's something that was a travesty in the sense that these were against both lawful residents in the United States as well as American citizens. And, in 2017, we saw this resurgence of this question as to, those who thought they were safe in the United States were finding themselves actually, targeted. And in thinking too about, this early photograph taken in 1942 by Dorothea Lange, this was in Oakland, and this is the storefront of a Japanese American business owner who, upon the notification of internment, put up this sign outside his store that literally just proclaimed, "I am an American," because he was. And it was his protest and also an attempt to kind of, make his place, to iterate that he belongs. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And, he found himself also having to sell his business and being carted off into, the concentration camps. And in thinking about, how to create this bridge between, 1942 and 2017, at that time, I decided to take that sign and to invert it, to put, white text on a black background, turn it into a textile panel, and hang it. And so the way it's supposed to be hung is as a room divider. It's hung from the ceiling, goes down to the floor, and the word American is actually compressed. The curtain gets drawn so that that word is difficult to read and becomes retracted, and in a way almost redacted. And I wanted to obscure that word because I felt that we were at this moment where we were both taking away rights of American citizens or those who were promised to become American or allowed to be in the United States. You can think about some of the rescinding or the threats against undocumented or DACA people in the United States. And, really question who is allowed to become an American? And is there also a way that somehow can be renegotiated or opened again. It really was, for me, a kind of bridge piece between, all the things historically that we'd already gone through, and yet we're still reliving in different ways. And along with that room divider, that textile panel, I had created a photograph. It's called Total Transparency, Portrait of N. And it's a portrait of an undocumented student at UC Berkeley that I had been working with. And, upon, the 2016 presidential election was then afterwards under threat for being deported. And so how do you take a photograph of someone who shouldn't be identified and is actually in danger if she's identified? We decided that we would have her sit with me or sit in the studio for me. And then I covered her with a digital print of a sheer textile panel printed in the Photoshop transparency backdrop. And in a way, this was to both shield her identity, as well as to talk about her possibility of removal, by covering her, by making her invisible, by making her transparent. It was both to protect her as well as, talk about that dangerous moment she was living in terms of being someone who could be taken away. And along with these works were also a series of chroma key green photographs in which I was recreating out of chroma key green fabric and objects the aftermath of protests. And so if you've ever been to a real street fight protest before, there's a lot left over afterwards. There's everything from like old weapons to flags to banners to bricks and rocks that litter the ground. And these were really intense protests. And so, by recreating them in the green chroma key color, I was also alluding to the media manipulations of the messages of protesters. And that, it was the way that the story was being narrated on the news. It was as if the people protesting white supremacy were the dangerous ones. And it's a really hard kind of thing to witness and to see. So having been there directly at the protests and looking at the media coverage afterwards, they were two entirely different things. And so, in thinking too about, I guess, revisions, of both history and narrative and frame and lenses, I started thinking a lot harder about, the construction of American history and why we tell the stories that we do, and also why they keep being resuscitated or relived constantly. So reenactments, historical reenactments, especially Civil War battles, are still something really popular in the United States. And, that's an interesting idea when you think about, well, what is it about this particular battle that doesn't go away? What is it that needs to keep happening? What is it that we haven't quite gotten over with? Or what is it that some people haven't, put down yet? I was also thinking about, a lot of the costumes that went around this, because, there's a whole sort of industry around the construction of theatrical costumes as well as reenactment clothing. And so on the left, you can see, some of the kind of sewing patterns that are made specifically for everything from Halloween costumes to, historical reenactments. And on the right-hand side is, an image of a contemporary Civil War reenactment. Something, it almost looks like it was pulled from the past, but is very today. So based on these historical American garments, I chose 3 that to me represented iconic moments of American history to recreate using the green screen chroma key backdrop fabric. So what you're looking at here are my hand sewn versions using the cotton fabric of exactly, what would be used as this backdrop to recreate 3 iconic moments in American history. The first being, the Plymouth Pilgrim, the colonial revolution, as well as the kind of Civil War era antebellum South. And the reason I chose these 3 moments was because, they're very, I think, pivotal moments that they keep getting narrated in ways that tell only one side of the story, or at least that's the way, traditional American history kind of tells it. Like, so the notion too of, the pilgrims coming to America and then having a feast with native folks, the idea of the colonial revolution, the founding of the United States, which then, accomplished democracy for all. And then, the grandeur of the South and, during the Civil War era. And by using the chroma key green fabric, I was hoping to really kind of, set off this notion of that these histories are totally fabricated and that we have a tendency to project upon them different stories depending on, what they're supposed to serve. And along with hand making them, it was really important for me to do this. I spent almost an entire year learning how to create 19th century ribbon embroidery, how to sew bonnets, also lace crochet. And I did this because I wanted to be involved directly in this fabrication of American history. Because as an American, and even though I'm an immigrant to the United States, I am American, and I feel fully American in the sense that I get to also re-narrate it, as well as get to own and deal with the baggage, both the racist history of the United States, as well as the ability to maybe rethink and reform it. Here's some details. I think it's quite lovely, actually. These are, of the bonnet with like ribbon flowers. And I also fabricated these to be shown at the Smithsonian Museum. So these were at the Renwick Gallery, which was the craft museum at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to also just make it very opulent, as if it was something that you could find in a historical museum, but, obviously was tweaked for a kind of contemporary understanding. And so, again, thinking about, I guess, nationhood and identity, I also worked in 2018, I worked on a project that wound up being shown at the Moscow Museum of Modern Art. This is a project called Rogue States, and it consists of I think 22 flags that hang down from the ceiling, almost like a kind of a United Nations style, gathering. And so again, this was, around the same time as the United States starting to kind of remove itself from, the global collaborations that it's seen itself a part of for decades, as well as, the beginnings of the rumblings of Brexit and this rising kind of nationalism. And so, this collection of flags, they kind of remind one, of different countries that you might have seen before. There's all sorts of kind of assumptions that one might have when they're looking at the colors or the symbols attached to it. But what they really are a collection of fictional flags pulled from Hollywood movies, Hollywood and European movies, in which there was an invented foreign country that was then considered the enemy. And so these flags, they're pulled from movies such as, well, this is, the kind of graphic that shows it, but the movies range from Hollywood action films to, comedies, to anything in which really, there was this made up foreign country that needed to be seen as the problem or the enemy. And by putting them all together, the question of, this collection of rogue states, for me, the bigger question really was, what is the United States actually? Is that the rogue state, in its ability to kind of construct other countries' enemy status? And, I'm also going to bring this up too, because, I've been thinking a lot about how in the last number of years, with my work being so focused on issues of American history, as well as representation, through photography or manipulation or, digital editing. The killings that happened in Atlanta raised a lot of issues for me in thinking about why the United States is still so confused over, how to define either hate crimes or, why these things exist. And, I'm pulling here on the left is something pulled directly from the New York Times. And I highlighted at the very bottom, after the headlines talks about the attacks and anti-Asian violence and Asian women being killed. And then it still comes to this conclusion that the motive was unclear, and it was maddening to hear this, like that somehow we needed to have this very clear statement, about why it happened to fully understand it. And it's disturbing. It's really disturbing, and I think it's something I'm still thinking about, but helped me realize like why also I think it's still important to kind of keep relooking at history, because we didn't get to this place out of nowhere, and so how I'm kind of moving forward with thinking about it, I'm pulling, I've also for the last, I guess 2 or 3 years now, I've been working in archives. I've been looking at historical archives, specifically in museums and public collections, to look at images and documents that outline a kind of past that in some cases we're sort of like unwilling to reckon with. And how that's kind of manifested, this is a shot of what it looks like for me to research in an archive. This was in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was researching photographs in the Missouri Historical Society, the St. Louis Public Library, and also the St. Louis Mercantile Library. And I was looking specifically at the time, because I had been invited by the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis to do an exhibition. And it just so happened that in 1904, there was a World's Fair that happened in St. Louis that featured a Filipino village of 1,200 Filipinos that were imported, and then also forced to kind of perform in this village, almost like a human zoo. So, going through the archives and looking at these images, these were direct interventions into the archive. So after you wind up looking at all these kind of historical and ethnographic photographs, and these were all taken in 1904 in St. Louis, of Filipino natives. And the reason these Filipinos were imported was because the Philippines was actually a United States colony. So after the Spanish-American War, the United States kind of won the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico as territories, or essentially as colonies. That's sort of the word that's not often used, but in essence, that's what it was. And so by importing Filipinos into the United States to be put on display, it was a way for the American public to kind of get to know their new colony. And in a lot of cases, these photographs also became the basis for a lot of incredibly racist constructions of, other peoples, as well as justifying American intervention in the Philippines. So after looking at, image after image of this, I started re-photographing myself covering them. And the reason to do that actually was both instinctual, because, how are you supposed to react and how are you supposed to re-edit images in an archive? My feeling was to kind of temporarily intervene in the way that the viewer was supposed to consume those images. Because again, a lot of these photographs were also distributed as tourist photos, so they were reproduced on postcards or in catalogs. A lot of it was for public consumption. And so by covering up the people, it was a form of both protecting them as well as deflecting the gaze. The gaze that was the looking that was supposed to then, categorize and conscript all these people into, being not quite human, essentially. And, I have like a lot of these photographs. And because I was just systematically going through image after image and both protecting and covering. And it came into an installation in the end called Block Out the Sun. And so this is from 2019, and it's a series of 8-inch by 10-inch photographs that are then displayed in a kind of vitrine. So the viewer can walk around it and essentially see the surrounding areas of the photographs, but are denied looking at the actual subject itself. And again, that was both as kind of protection and denial. And so, again, like thinking about, the staging of photographs. I'm bringing this up, this prompt again, just because it makes an appearance in the apparatus of photography, and thinking about, this is now, I'm showing images of color calibration charts from early photographic processes. This is a one that was made by Adobe Systems actually in the 1980s and 1990s. And you're supposed to like check the color of your monitor against this printed card, which featured this kind of weird, Carmen Miranda-esque brownish person with, fruits and all these other things, decorating her hat. And you can see the word Adobe on there and all these color charts. Color calibration charts are fascinating because if you start looking at them, you realize that, they're supposed to exemplify, standard images. So you'll see these still lifes. You'll also see these like very kind of, saccharine portraits of people. There's also these, I think, really interesting ways that they show racialized skin types or skin tones. This is, I think, a German version of one. And so I wound up collapsing a lot of different references to photographic processes and imaging techniques in this large-scale installation called Dodge and Burn, Visible Storage. This was also at the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis, and it's a large platform consisting of hundreds of objects mixed up in it. And it's actually meant to be confusing. You're meant to kind of go in and search through and look at lots of different things that may or may not make sense with each other. And it's like a pileup of references, almost the way, the internet operates. And you'll see, chroma key green objects, artificial plants, patterns. There's also these kinds of image objects where I was downloading images off the internet, both from Amazon.com and other sort of vending sites, as well as museum collections, like the Metropolitan Museum's collection of Filipino artifacts. And I was rampantly downloading them, printing them out, and then adhering them to these wooden panels, almost like theatrical props. And there's a mix also of color, skin tone charts, and all sorts of things that for me are really hinting at this notion that, the construction of both American identity is incredibly racialized and is also set up against this notion of foreign and native and, inside and outside. And it's all caught up in historical document, in photographic calibration charts. There's like stock photos of tropical fruit. And there's these weird little emojis, figures that come in of both fists and poops and flames that sort of dot the installation and have this kind of humorous yet also critical commentary. And in it are also, in green chroma key, references to some of the racist icons that, we've been kind of subject to the last couple of years, such as, maybe these green baseball caps, sort of similar to MAGA hats, as well as chroma key green tiki torches that have been, put into the installation. And, you peek through and you can see vintage photographs also of the Philippines as a colony. A lot of images of people looking at themselves in mirrors or being doubled or looking back out at the viewer. Insider references about anthropology and ethnography. Objects downloaded from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's database, Filipino revolutionaries, masks from Amazon.com, camouflage, textures. It's this giant clusterfuck, actually. And I wanted it to be really confusing, but I did want it in the end to kind of speak together about this battle that's happening, both in contemporary culture, about the meaning of American history and where we were supposed to take it, as well as hidden signs and symbols of, say, white supremacy and the invisibility of white supremacy in, our contemporary landscape, the absolute presence of it and its supposed invisibility in the sense that it's in everything. So, here's a detail again of fists and color calibration charts. And, again, I'm going to switch gears. I have one more project to kind of share, and it has to do with a kind of revisioning again of ethnographic photography. This is a photograph of a Filipino Igorot child that was taken during the 1904 World's Fair. He was imported into St. Louis, was this very popular character, actually. People loved the photographs of him because he represented this kind of purity and innocence and, this kind of, this foreign exotic child that must be raised, in a civilized manner. And this is a very typical shot, almost, like set up with a backdrop and in a native gear. And then I found this other image, which I thought was really interesting. This is one where the child is posed now taking the photograph. And this is obviously is not a real photo. Like, I don't think the child was actually, taking photographs, but thinking about this as a metaphor for what happens if you flip the lens, if you put in the hands of the subject the right to take photographs or recreate the presentation of themselves, what would happen? And so I'm going to end with this new exhibition that's currently up right now at Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco. And it's a series of works that deal with the archive. I was a 2019-2020 Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow in Washington, D.C. at the National Museum of American History. And my project was to examine and look for images and documents of the Philippines of Filipinos and the Philippines in the National Museum of American History. And that seems like a very straightforward thing, right? If the Philippines was a colony of the United States, it must have a lot of evidence in the National Museum. And what does that evidence look like, and what does it say about that colony? So, through my excavations, I'm just going to run quickly through the exhibition images so you can kind of get a sense of the show. It's a pretty straightforward photo-based show. And I did that on purpose too, because I wanted the images to kind of not get overly cluttered with objects, and I wanted them to, be very tight in what they were representing. But all these images and works were pulled from working with the archive at both the Smithsonian and also in St. Louis through my earlier excavations. And they dealt with kind of representing the images in ways that I think were resistant, or even, kind of like saying something different politically than what the images were originally taken for. And there was also a video version of Block Out the Sun in which the images, about 50 images were sequenced, and they change every time you hear the sound of a camera clicking. So sort of like the forward motion of a slide projector. And the images are also piled on top of each other. These are photographic collages. They're meant to simulate also the kind of confusion of the archive. A lot of the images are also incredibly digital or pixelated, because in some cases the image I was given access to in the archives was actually pixelated or not high enough resolution. And so this is the camera that was actually, would have been used during the turn of the century in the Philippines. The image I received or was able to get from the Smithsonian was highly digitized, and I thought it was actually kind of perfect. Because, my show is called Native Resolution. And that's a kind of play on words, because native resolution, the term, also refers to this notion of, it's the innate amount of digital information in a digital image. And so if your native resolution is not very high, if the image is low resolution, you will never get a better image from it. You will never get a better print. My idea is that the American historical lens, when looking outside of itself as a country, is inherently a low resolution endeavor. The images that I was finding of the Philippines was fraught with all sorts of everything from mistakes to omissions to outright misinformation. And it basically showed what I feel to be this very incomplete look at the way an empire is witnessing its colony. Like, for instance, I'm going to actually wrap up this really soon, but, for instance, the detail of the image on the right is pulled from this kind of collage of photographs, and it's pulled directly from the National Anthropological Archive, and it's just labeled Portrait of Man, and on the side, a kind of handwritten note that says Philippines, ? And I think this is hilarious, because this is a photograph of Jose Rizal, who is one of the most important Philippine revolutionaries, in the entire country. And yet his inability to be recognized or legible in the American archive, I thought, was part of the problem itself. And so Portrait of Man, as this kind of anonymous thing without even necessarily, knowing exactly who or even what country. And so I'm just going to move forward to give a sense of what these look like. You don't get a sense of the country or the culture at all. It's just a massive amounts of both like data and snippets and information all kind of piled onto each other. And in many cases, you know, I use photographs of people, but they're hidden or they're peeking out behind other documents. Here's some details. It's a very three-dimensional piece. And then in some cases too, you know, the images are actually, what the object that's being photographed is actually competing with the calibration chart, which is quite larger than itself. And so, you know, these two things kind of enter the archive together, like forever, you know, placed in conjunction with each other. The archive itself becomes a visible space and almost like overwhelms or subsumes what is being archived. This is pile-up herbaria. And, you know, again, I'm just going to quickly run through these now. Soft body fragments. This is a digital composite of clay pottery shards from the Philippines and located in the Freer and Sackler galleries of Asian art. And so I digitally superimposed the shards on top of each other so that they actually created a kind of compound form. And to me, this reminds me of like trying to, you know, make the fragments whole again, you know, to join them in ways that they can't as they actually are in the archive. And then a set of what I'm calling after images. These are reworked and crumpled photogravures of ethnographic photographs of Filipinos taken during the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. So they're crumpled and you know, represented in a way, again, to deny the viewer the viewer's act of looking, but also to, you know, re-edit or reimagine, you know, what could be said, because a lot of these images circulated too in incredibly racist ways. You know, they were not meant as actual kind of cultural documents. They were meant to really prove the kind of inferiority of these peoples. Also representing documents. This is fixed focus, dead center. It's 36 photographs of from the archive files of anthropologist Dean Conant Worcester, who is one of the main anthropologists who was responsible with really providing the documentation of why the Philippines needed to be a United States colony. And so in rephotographing his documents, I decided to focus on the errors in the documents. So you'll see in the middle of each 8x10 photograph is an error. And then, you know, a kind of edited surrounding of it, because I didn't want to just represent what are some pretty racist documents, actually. You know, I wanted to show the errors in them to point at the notion, too, that, you know, these documents are fallible. They're one-sided, and in many cases, also, they contain, you know, false observations or things that are, you know, quite skewed in terms of, you know, who's doing the looking. Also, you know, again, playing with photographs while in the archives. I'm actually going to wrap it up because I want to make sure that we leave room for questions at the end. But let's see where I'm going to leave it on, I think this image. So yeah, block out the sun. Because again, I keep coming back to it. Like, you know, how are we, when thinking about history, when thinking about our responsibility also, how can we both work with the images that we find, as well as critically re-examine and maybe even represent in ways that don't limit, you know, the possibilities of what it could say? And, you know, if we're dealing with, especially archives that are incredibly, you know, one-sided, you know, how do we intervene and make new meaning? So with that, I'm going to end right here, and I hope to open up a really great discussion. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was wonderful. I was trying to write down notes, and there's something you said towards the end. It was about the American archives, or the American view of its own history, is such a low resolution endeavor.
Absolutely.
That's perfect. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a perfect description of it. We have several questions in the chat. I want to hit on one first just because we're kind of, it's more recent. So I noticed that your early works are removed from your Filipino-ness And your work is not necessarily speaking about identities, but when and why did you start inserting the Filipino images and references into your work? Did you happen to stumble upon them? Is identity important to you as a Filipino American and as an artist? So yeah,
Yeah.
when did you start working with that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question actually, because I knew some people, be like, oh, she's all of a sudden, yeah, working with issues of her heritage or identity. But I will actually say I'm not. I'm actually interested. So I chose the photographs and documents of the Philippines actually as for me, it's a kind of test case, right? It's like, what does it mean to search through an American archive for evidence of its colony? And the Philippines just happens to be one of those colonies. I feel like I can kind of recognize certain things. And so I decided to use that. But I'm actually more interested in the white gaze. This is actually not anything about like cultural reality. A lot of these things were posed. A lot of the photographs were staged, and so there's not really real, at least for me, this exploration of like a real identity or a real culture,
Right.
really through the frame and the lens of a white American kind of colonial intervention. And so, yeah, it's interesting, right?
It is, and I'm thinking of like is because I'm also thinking about the audience. Well, I'm gonna get back to the audience question in a second because that hit me right off the bat. But what you just said about like interested in white, but you got the grant or the fellowship
Yeah, yeah.
from the Smithsonian, right? So was that kind of using your Filipino-ness, sorry, um, a way to kind of get in the door? Do you think if you would have proposed it as looking into the white gaze, do you think you would have gotten it based on like maybe who was given the award? Like, oh wow, this person can really speak to this, and yeah,
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting question, right? I think that, yeah, probably the expectations or the process of, I think what's very legible to people is when they think an artist of color is searching for their identity. That's like this very sort of like, oh, that's great. And sure, maybe that's part of what I was interested in, but I also didn't, how about this? So for added value, right? Added value turned out to be this like really crazy project in the end that when I was pitching it, I did not describe it as being this like, we're going to look through the white lens at all this
right,
stuff. No. I just said, we're going to like playfully recategorize, these subjects and knowledge, things in order to, come up with new ideas for the audience. So I think maybe it's in the eye of the beholder as to what's happening.
yeah. Well, it's also a critique on like you getting the is it the fellowship? Is it a okay for you getting the fellowship and also using the terminology of what they were looking for
Maybe.
is also a critique on the institution of what you're doing anyway.
Maybe. I
Right?
mean, I do have a sense that if I stated upright that my goal was to sort of like, yeah, speculate on the white gaze,
Mhm.
that it might have been met with a little bit more resistance. But it's hard to say actually. Maybe I'm not being generous enough with what the criteria could have been.
Right, right. And you had mentioned the added value piece. So one of the question, and that's where my question about audience came in, was I was in my head thinking of were you arranging these new categories, creating these new categories, knowing that the audience of the San Francisco Museum of Art is primarily would be a middle class white audience.
Oh, actually, it is and it isn't. So I
Okay.
think one of the things about being present there, I saw so many people walk in there and they were like floored because finally they were looking at an entire body of knowledge that was organized the way that they internally see it.
Right, right,
It's
right.
there for them. And so like, especially younger people, I mean, it was almost like they'd been seen, like that their realities were being basically said, affirmed, right?
Right.
And I think that was actually quite magical because it's such a small twist. We change a couple signs, think creatively about a different perspective, and all of a sudden it's, same books, totally different lens.
Right. And we relied on those institutions to give us those categories, and we just assume that those institutions are truth or have a sense of truth in it, right? When someone comes in and changes the categories, it's something really simple.
Yeah.
But, really deep. And one of the questions that popped up in Q&A regarding added values, like, did you come up with the new categories after you had the books, using the books that help you create the new categories, or did you have those categories kind of going in? Or did you see what they had and it became like a joke or something, like, as a, like, where would this fit?
It was a mix of both. So luckily, I purposely pulled in 2 other artist collaborative teams to help me. So I kind of loosely referenced them. One was Related Tactics, which are 3 individual artists. And then the Pralinger Library, who are I would call them like labor activist archivists. And so each of those groups already had a kind of like lens, that they are constantly looking through. And so for us, it was this very quick and playful thing. Like sometimes someone would just come up, like I had the idea, men's studies, what's that going to be like? And that was super fun. And then, niche things would come up, but then sometimes we would just have a lot of certain books. Like it turns out that Bill Gates book, The Road Ahead, I mean, there's like a million of them out in the world, like we had this huge amount. And so what that also shows you is then, the kind of general sense of vast amounts of certain types of knowledge, right, that circulate. And so that also became something to respond to,
Right. So this next question is going to shift gears a little bit. And the question is, are there other artists experimenting with textiles that you know of? And of course, you could probably name off many. Do you think the use of textiles in art will become more commonplace?
No. Well, I think maybe because of the way I've been looking at things already, I kind of feel they are, but so there's textiles as a kind of like formal discipline, like you can go study textiles. Right. But then there's also a lot of contemporary artists that may not define themselves as textiles artists, but they use textiles. So there's a lot of overlap there. And maybe it's similar to how like ceramics right now is also, sort of both a craft field in its own right, and then also a kind of contemporary art, like intersection.
Right. And just as a plug for the new gallery here at Austin Peay, in the fall, we are going to have a textile, specifically a garment, the use of garments to talk about American histories, an exhibition there. So if any of the students are out there and question about textiles or so, definitely check that show. It's going to be in November. So is there any other more questions? I mean, I could ask you tons of questions. I'm really interested in your use of archives. As a kind of an institutional critique, I've mentioned that a few times already, but also in a way kind of like Fred Wilson with Mining the Museum, and how he took these objects and just placed them in a different context to rewrite history or to give a different narrative to those objects. How do you see yourself fitting in with kind of that, like going into these archives and kind of, I don't know, not necessarily rewriting history, but it may be shining a spotlight on what we've been taught this whole time?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about it, like, historical knowledge, the type that's in museums, let's just say, or like historical societies, or all those areas in which we sort of use those as a kind of repository, of that we value. So a lot of it is all tied up in, the objects that are in there, the images, the documents, that kind of thing. So I feel that, by re-looking at them, I'm sort of temporarily intervening in it, because honestly, like those collections are not going to change. They're not. I mean, they're not all of a sudden like sell off things, or like or I don't know. They're there because they have a symbolic and also a kind of economic value.
Right.
museums. And so I feel like when I get invited to work with them, I have this like small moment, this like very quick and fast way to just shuffle it up a little bit. Or yeah, you're right, like highlight certain things, maybe, you know, highlight gaps or holes. You know, and that's something that I'm actually interested in doing in future projects. Like I'm working on a project at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth. And so I'm going to be looking at damaged objects, things that have had damage in the American collection, because I want to think of that as a metaphor. So yeah, again, it's like, it's sort of like a mixed, I don't want to say a mixed endeavor. Museums and archives are interesting because they do hold the key to, you know, a lot of like knowledge that we value. And yet it's all sort of like, in many cases, they're unfortunately sort of like told to say a certain thing all the time, you know? And so what I'm hoping on is that maybe by bringing in someone who isn't as wed to certain notions, you know, I can like have them say, take the liberties, you know, to say something else.
Right. It reminds me of the issue several years ago with the history books that for K through 12 history books standardized. I think it was like 5th grade or 8th grade, and taking the same exact publisher and looking at a history book from Georgia and a history book from Texas or Florida and Texas, or forget Texas and somebody, and how the little pages were different and things were omitted that they were teaching the students in Texas from the same publisher. It's fascinating to me. And also what you mentioned too about going through the archives and you brought up Sackler and the Sackler wing. So I'm like already, there's a whole nother context with that. Yeah, and I have another question too with this work in Dallas, you said, with the Dallas Museum, with the damaged items, were they accepted damaged or were they damaged while in the care of the museum?
Oh, so this project is, it has yet to unfold, which means that we're just setting it up now. But in most museum collections that have like, you know, quite a lot of things, there's a lot of damage. Like,
oh, yeah.
You know, so whether that's like works on paper, you know, and sometimes it's a conservation thing, like maybe, you know, something hasn't been stored properly, not in the museum necessarily, but, you know, prior to when it got there. A lot of sculptures, you know, or objects, if they'd had a life prior to entering the collection. There's also, you know, all that conservation, you know, kind of what do they call it? The condition reports that happen on objects. That's a very detailed kind of thing. And so when I was in DC at the Smithsonian, they have a conservation lab for the National Portrait Gallery. And I was able to go back there and look at a lot of damage on, say, like busts of George Washington. You know, and I mean, that's interesting as a metaphor. You know, George Washington is kind of like the iconic, you know, the founder of American history, and yet also a slaveholder.
Right.
So, you know, there's, and so what does the metaphor of examining that damage, what can that possibly say too about, you know, some of the fractures in American history?
Right. Well, speaking of this upcoming project, one of the questions, what are some other projects that you're currently working on, other than the damaged pieces?
Yeah. So at the Arizona State University Museum in the summer, I'm in an exhibition called Undoing Time, which is looking at art in the age of carceral politics. So like incarceration and, you know, and prison. And what I was invited to actually do a project based on relooking at ethnographic photography as an early precursor to things like the mugshot, and how photography was used to kind of create criminal types. Because, you know, that's also another kind of dark period of American photographic history, was, you know, that a lot of early ethnographic photographs were also to kind of pick apart in a kind of almost eugenics way, you know, like categories and levels of races of people. And then that also led to notions of like criminality. So what I'm doing is I'm erasing ethnographic photographs from the Smithsonian anthropology collection. So I'm downloading a lot of them, and I'm doing this like really quick and dirty. Like there's this tool in Photoshop called the healing brush tool.
Yeah.
It's terrible. I'm just going, Reep. I'm like healing the image. And so what happens is you get this really weird like wipe, like it wipes up a portion of it, and yet there's this kind of phantom image that's left over.
Right.
And I've been kind of looking at that as almost like letting the original person who is in that photograph, letting them like go away, letting them exit this sort of like category of what they were supposed to represent forever and ever and ever in that photograph.
Right. So how do you, another question. So how do you continue your relationships, or how does your relationship look like with the institutions you are critiquing, such as the Smithsonian? Like, how do you approach that, and how is your...
Oh, yeah. Well, so the interesting thing about the Smithsonian Fellowship is that they never ask for follow-up really afterwards. Like there's no exhibition attached to it. There's actually no requisite that you need to even make an exhibition from it. So it's really just a purely research potential. I actually haven't had a chance to kind of like go back or, I guess like share anything out with the museum per se, but I am included in an upcoming Smithsonian exhibition where they're taking the Block Out the Sun photographic project, and it's going to be in an exhibition about what is it? The future, something about how industry and like industry and invention shows the future. And
Right.
World's Fairs, which was where that all took place, was one of those areas where it was this big expo basically for technology.
Right. Do you have some time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because this is a good one that I think a lot of our students could hear. So how would you advise young artists to challenge certain framings of their research into identity related, or in general, how do you suggest young artists to navigate in and around pressures from institutions to create identity related works of art?
That's a
great question. That is a great question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's a double-edged sword, because here's the thing, right? Like, I'm not at all, so my position is I'm an artist. I'm also an Asian American artist. I'm also a Filipino American artist. I'm also a female Filipino, there's all these like kind of subcategories, right? And there's no kind of like hierarchy of them. Like, they're just all there all at the same time. And yet what the art world, I feel like, or the audience really demands of artists of color especially, is that we articulate our identities in our work, and that we do it legibly and in ways that are easily consumed by the general public. Right. And so anything that looks cultural, if you're an artist of color, it must be somehow about your identity, in this very innate way. And so that's why I'm very quick to challenge, actually, that my work is not about it's not about looking at Filipino identity. It's looking at the white gaze on Filipinos, because there's nothing authentic about that, Right. And so then what happens then is, though, for younger artists, they have to make choices, I guess, about, both what they want to make work about, because I'm not saying at all that you shouldn't make work about your identity, right? Like, I think that you should be able to, and that's not something that you should feel pressured to or not. It should be something that comes from you. But then there are certain expectations that different audiences have about that. And my big advice is to be as contradictory and complicated and weird as possible. Because like if you look at, I've been a professional artist now for 25 years. And if you look at, like, on my website, if you go down, you look at this whole giant, amount of projects on there. I think probably people would say that very few of them relates directly back to a kind of Filipino identity or an identifiable one. But I would also argue that all of it has to do with maybe my background as being someone who has seen themselves as, existing on the so-called margins of, the larger culture. And that there's a perspectives in there that you can read as being Filipino American, but they just don't look, you know, they don't perform, you know, maybe in expected ways.
Right. Right. Yeah, because I was remember you had posted something today, and this reminded me of the social media question that's popped up. Because you actually posted something on day about that very similar thing. You had like 5 slides or so, and I read those, and I'm like, wow, yeah, like I'm totally guilty of doing that myself, you know.
Oh, we all are.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and you know, but being cognizant of it and being aware of it enough to notice, that's the hard part, right? So, and with work like yours, bringing it to the forefront is incredible. One last question, or a couple of them, maybe.
Oh,
Twist your arm. Twist your arm. Like you're 2 hours behind us, you can catch up. So regarding social media, so a lot of students, right, on social media, what is your relationship to social media like these days? And do you see it as a tool for art making, art research, or just perhaps all things?
yeah. So one thing that I really like about the kind of quick and dirty way that Instagram works, let's just say, like Facebook, I've sort of like migrated off of. Like I think Facebook just got kind of just ugh, for Instagram, I think has been really interesting because, so, you know, I'm also an educator, right? So I spend a lot of time working with students and also trying to kind of talk with students about the process of making art. So not the final product, but like, what does research look like? You know, what does prototyping or experimenting or, you know, all the things that we do as artists that are not necessarily the final product, but is part of the process.
Right.
So I use my Instagram account sometimes as a kind of like documentation of that process. So I'll post, you know, a work in progress or ideas or sketches or musings or, you know, things like that. Because it's a kind of catalog for myself, you know, like in a way I can kind of look back on it and go, oh, you know, that's really interesting. But I also want to demystify for others what this work looks like, you know, behind the scenes. So whether it's like, you know, I spent 2 months in Washington, D.C. looking through archives. So every day I would just post these like weird, random images of, you know, what it's like to be in there. I think it's actually really fun. You know, I use social media as both a way to document things for myself, but also, well, also to amplify other things, you know, aggregate information.
Right. Right. Yeah. I use it a lot to look at other artists. Yeah. I mean, you're one of the few that kind of seem to update their website on a regular basis, but it doesn't happen. So, and the social media gives me a sense of what they're working on now and the conversations they're having, in order to, you know, to bring these artists to our campus. And it's just cool to kind of, I'm really fascinated to see a bunch of artists post non-art things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
actually,
That gives
yeah,
me so much more insight to what their work is about than them trying to tell me what their work is about.
yeah. Well, I don't see my Instagram as my uh, professional website. You know,
Right.
that's why the professional website is there. Like that's the project. It's all the kind of like when it's all packaged and, you know,
Right.
archived. But for me, the social media, Instagram is like it's like behind the scenes.
Right. Right. Well, I'm going to give you one last question because I'm kind of curious about this too. So, how do you balance these many extensive projects and teaching at the university?
Yeah, that's a really good. I'm still trying to figure that one out too. I mean,
Right.
you know, I've been an educator, oh goodness, now for like about 14, 15 years, you know, at the college level, but as a professor now for about 8. So, you know, that's a full-time job and
Yeah.
you know, part of it is teaching. The other part is like research, you know, and service to the university. But thankfully, you know, summers, I also had a sabbatical right before,
Oh, congratulations.
during COVID, yay, sabbatical. That was when all the projects had to get shut down, which really sucked.
Right. Right.
Yeah, but you know, it's a juggle. I mean, I guess like for anyone who's interested in, you know, these kinds of dual pathways, I would just say that, you know, a lot of my projects are also, they can be very long term, right? Like, so sometimes I'll know that it's going to take me like 2 or 3 years to like do this thing. And then I have usually lots of other small, weird, quick and dirty things that I'm doing also. So I have usually about maybe 5 projects that are sort of like in parallel at, all at the same time, but at different levels,
Right.
of city.
Well, it seems like you're balancing it fairly well. I know this year, even though you had a sabbatical, coming back to teaching during Zoom has been different. That's being nice. Hopefully that'll get back to normal very soon. But it looks like you're doing great. Your work has been fun to follow. It's so fascinating. I really wish we could have you here because I could continue talking about this stuff for a while. So I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening. This is our last CECA Visiting Artist Speaker of the academic year. So thank you to everyone who's continued to come out. I greatly appreciate it. Please follow us on social media to see what's coming up next year. We have a great lineup that is continuing to grow for next year. But Stephanie, thank you so much. It's been such a real pleasure getting to know more about your work. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, no, and it's great talking with you too. Finally,
I know, right? I think we've
talked
a long time ago, and the whole world has shifted since.
Yeah.
So, but we're still here, so we're pushing through. So I appreciate you being flexible with us and with us making it work. So I really appreciate that. Absolutely. So with that, good night, everyone. Thank you so much, and have a great night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.